Creating the Perfect Image is presented by David Goldshaw, President, Oshaw Dental Productions.
I'm David Goldshaw. I'm the President of Oshaw Dental Productions, and here we talk about and educate on dental materials. I'd like to be able to explain to you how we're going to look at and work with impression materials, in this case, alginates. Now, it's very important to first off look at our types of impression trays. There's a variety of impression trays we can choose, and in this case we're going to look at the plastic trays versus the metal trays. There's a variety that we can choose from, and most people here in North America and Canada, we're looking, I think most people that again look at asepsis, sterilization, disinfection, use the perforated trays. I like to be able to compare the difference between the perforated, the solid trays, and then we'll look at the plastic trays. Now, think of it this way. The perforated trays, which are considered the most popular types of impression trays in the marketplace, we put our impression materials, our alginates inside here. They're then put into the mouth, and the material flows through the impression trays. So we lose the compression inside here. This is taking what we call a mucostatic impression. Compare that to the solid impression tray. The solid tray, which a lot of people don't like using because they thought it doesn't hold or adhere the impression material as well as the perforated tray. Actually, about 5 years ago, the manufacturers made the rims around and also internally thicker, so it actually gives as much, if not better, adhesion than the perforated tray. When we put the impression tray inside here, the material inside here, the alginate, and compress it, it completes and produces a much more compressive impression known as a mucocompressive impression. So if we compare the two, we get more definition with again a solid impression tray versus a perforated impression tray. So with our choice being for a regular dentition, with all the teeth being there, we want to have a mucocompressive impression tray. The solid tray is our choice. When we have partial or edentulous cases, we should be using our perforated trays because we don't want to compress soft, flabby tissues. Now let's have a quick look at our plastic trays, and these are considered disposable. They come in this case as a half arch, of course, full impression trays. The difference between these is I go into a lot of dental offices and I see what's happening. They actually put these into a cold soak solution overnight, whereas they're considered disposable. Disposal means you throw it away after each use. The problem being that since it's a plastic, a shiny surface almost, that they don't get quite the adhesion that you normally need to use. So we should be using a good adhesive inside. So in order to do that, I'm using a vegetable-based adhesive called TAC, T-A-C, Tray Adhesive Compound, from a company called Bosworth. It does actually come with two of these little depressors, and it's nice and easy to use. So I'll just make sure that it's simply adhered. By spraying this lightly onto the surface, I then wait 1 minute, and then I can apply my impression material down inside. And no matter how hard I try afterwards, it will not separate from the tray. It stays within. So it means to say that the trays have to be thrown away afterwards since we can't clean out the material. So that's looking at the impression trays. Now we're going to have a look at how to mix an alginate. Let's talk a little bit about alginates. Most alginates nowadays are pre-packaged inside bags such as this. Why? Because it gives it a longer shelf life. There's a small amount of vacuum inside, and in this case we have 5 years shelf life, which is good. So it's going to keep us away from obviously any type of impurities getting inside. The problem being that as soon as we put it into a container, a canister like this, as soon as moisture gets inside, it can contaminate or change the flow of the properties of the material. So we want to keep the lid on pretty much at all times. Handling the material. The alginate itself will settle since it's made from 3 different particle sides, and it does need to be fluffed up. The incorrect way of fluffing an alginate is by doing this or by doing this to the material. It hurts the material that's inside. When alginate is manufactured, it actually is made in 3 different particle sizes, which are all soft and round, spherical shaped. The material itself, if we ever had to shake it up like this, those particles bang against each other and break, and they become like jigsaw piece puzzles that don't fit together. We've just changed the working time, the setting time, the dimensional stability. So to fluff an alginate, any alginate, we put it onto its side, the canister, revolve the canister 3 times. Once it's gone through 3 revolutions, it's fluffed. What we should be seeing that when we open the can, the lid, we shouldn't have clouds of dust that exhume out there. That dust, which is made from a material called diatomaceous earth, can enter into the lungs and cause a problem of silicosis. So we try to stay away from that. So, handling ability. Always try and make sure that when we're working together, we keep our alginate bowl separate from our stone bowl. That means to say we need to have 2 different styles of bowls. In this case, I'm working with a very thin, flexible type of bowl material. And the same thing for our spatulas. Our spatulas themselves are very flexible, and these are a nylon-based material which can be heat sterilized. So let's have a look at how to mix the alginate. Now, before I normally handle any type of impression materials, normally the thing I'm going to be doing is washing my hands. Washing my hands under the sink, I normally use warm or hot water. So what will that do to the water that we're going to be measuring off our alginate afterwards? It means to say that normally that's going to be warm or hot. And how's that going to affect the alginate? It's going to accelerate the set, which is no good. So instead of using the preset water measures that come with the material, I've got one of these little gadgets which are called the H2O dispenser, and this actually comes from the Maytech manufacturing company in California. Great little idea. Now, there is actually a holding area for the water, and as I squeeze this with a light pressure, the water is pushed through a straw in the center. As the water's coming out of the straw in the center, it comes to this little white cap. I then let go. It then sucks back to the perfect amount of 2 scoops, which is preset. If I want to change it for 3 scoops, I would turn it this way, 1 scoop back the other way, so I can always vary the amount from between 1 to 3 scoops. It's also very good for tequila, vodka, whiskey, I hear. So, let's take hold of our bowl that we're going to be mixing, and I can put the powder in first, but it's actually more comparable to put the water into the bowl first. In this case, I've got room temperature water and the perfect amount from our H2O dispenser. I'm now going to take hold of our alginate. In this case, I'm going to be using the Kromatica color change material. This powder itself is fast set, but it's still going to give me enough working time, etc., to handle the material. Now, prior to doing this, I've just put the powder scoop back inside, and I'm just closing that for the moment. I'm going to be using our impression tray, which is the solid tray. But what I'm going to do, instead of using wax at the posterior borders to dam it in, and if I didn't do that, what would happen is the distal area would be lost as the material's flowing out the back, and of course down the throat and on the tonsils, etc. We want to stop that from happening. So let's show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to use a material which is called Damit. Damit is a great little material. It's actually a fiber-based product. As I pull off a small piece of material, close this off, I then apply that to the posterior border of the tray. I then fold this over with a light pressure, and it's now sealing the back of the tray. And in this way, it's going to hold the material within the tray, allowing it to obviously compress more and picking up the distal areas which are normally lost as the material drags or flows out the back of the impression tray. So our tray is prepared. And this is what I would normally do. I have my patient who's sat in the chair, and I'm going to relax them because they're very nervous to start with. The best way to relax them is give them a glass of room temperature water. It relaxes the patients. You can see them bodily relaxing. It also helps to wet the mouth, which of course when we're using an alginate is going to break down the surface tension. So that way I will not now have to wet my finger on the surface of an alginate, which a lot of people out there are doing. And in this case, it's going to produce a much smoother surface. Now, if the patient's a little bit elderly, or if they might have a thicker, ropier saliva, that room temperature water that they're going to rinse through will be broken down as well. So, I'm now ready to mix the alginate. So let's take hold of our spatula. And in this case, I'm going to take 2 scoops of the material, so packing the scoops tightly. Because I revolved or tumbled the canister 3 times, I don't need to tap on the surface of the scoop that's normally taught in most schools. I now slide off the amount, and I'm going to do this twice. Apply that into our bowl and do the same thing again. And at this case, I will then close back and then start to mix the material. As I combine the two together, I want to see that I get a good homogeneous mix. Now, as I'm starting to mix, this material, of course, is a color change material, so it shows us when we're fully combined together. I wet the material first, and then I continue spatulating until the material starts to moisten and wet. And I'm now just pushing the air from the mix. Now, at this point, I've got our material that's mixed. I'm going to take a small amount of the material, and just to show you how we got a good mix of material, this is what we should be looking for. It's dense, it's thick, it stays on the spatula, it doesn't drip off. I normally take a small amount of the material on the back of the patient's hands and tell them to watch this whilst I'm going into the mouth to take the impression. So it's sort of, again, distracting them. So I'm packing my impression tray, and I'm now ready for our impression. So we're normally going into a wet mouth environment. As we go in, we apply a small amount of pressure, and normally I'll be pulling my lips down over and then muscle molding, getting a good functional impression. This material, as being a color change, as we can see, it changes from purple to pink to white. When it's white, we know the material's set, and that's normally within 60 seconds with the most alginates. But in this case, with this material, I've still got the same working ability, but it's only 20 seconds, so it's much faster, kinder to the patient. After the 20 seconds, we'll see the material again starting to turn white. We know the material's set. Now, of course, if this was inside the mouth, the warmth, the humidity of the mouth has a tendency of accelerating that set. So I'll just leave this for a moment longer, and we can see that once the material's set, it can peel off without obviously sticking to the skin. The same case with our mouth. So I'll just let this a moment longer, and then we're ready to set and separate it out. So normally we would then withdraw from the mouth, and we end up with a nice, smooth, clean impression. At this point, we want to have a look at two things. Obviously looking at the accuracy of our material, but more importantly, let's look at our trays and our bowls. We have over here dirty bowls and dirty spatulas. We want to clean them. So the nice thing about this material is it cleans very well from the spatula, and the same thing from the bowl. So just a light pressure and away we go. So we've now cleaned up nicely, and let's look at how to store our material. Now, most alginates on the marketplace store for around 6 hours. That means to say if we don't pour them quickly, the material itself has a tendency of contracting, shrinking, and changing its accuracy. This material is actually, through the manufacturing procedure, they coat the particles with a polymer through the manufacturing procedure. And so what that does, it keeps the condensation, the moisture present within the material. When we're handling the material, it still handles a little bit thicker but nicer to work with, and we've got a nice set. Now, once the material is set like this, we have an accuracy of 4 days. Now, in order to keep that accuracy, what most people would normally do is take hold of paper towels, Kleenex, etc. They then normally wrap them around the impression and wet them and then bag them. 5 years ago, that was the case. We could do that safely, but not anymore. Things have changed because the paper we're using nowadays is recycled. When it gets wet, it's made to break down, and then fibers will actually depart from the surface and impart into the alginate impression surface. So that's no good, because otherwise what would happen is when we pour up a model, we'll touch the surface of the model, and where it hadn't set correctly, we would have a thin residue of stone on our fingers. What we do need to do is wet the paper towels, place it underneath the impression, so not wrapped or not on the surface, and then we can put it into a Ziploc bag or a Tupperware type of container, something that's airtight, and it will hold it for 4 days stability. So from a Friday right through to Tuesday the next week, no problems. Long weekend, you can go ahead and enjoy it and come back, and you've still got a good, clean impression that's still accurate as it was from day one. I'm now going to explain to you, instead of the hand mix, we're going to use the machine called the alginator. This is a bowl that revolves around and actually does the mixing for us. It takes out a lot of the stress of having to compress the impression material each time, trying to get out of the air bubbles. This operates on 2 speeds. There's a low and a high speed. You also notice that there's the alginate bowl and there's a larger bowl. The bowls add and detach quite easily with like a bayonet fitting. So it's possible to, again, to mix up stone, which we'll show a little bit later on in this procedure. So let's show you how to mix the alginate using the alginator. Now this is especially good if we're doing a lot of mixes in a busy office where we're taking a lot of impressions for whether it be from a case of impression trays, obviously for where we're doing bleaching trays, mouth guards, or it could be many other things. So I'm going to measure off my water. Again, I'm going to use this little H2O dispenser. And these are things you can pick up from your local supply company. This is around $29, just to give you an idea. So as I squeeze this, it's going to measure off our 2 levels of water, which I'm putting directly into our mixing bowl. I'm going to do the same thing again for our alginate. So packing our scoop tightly, sliding off, and then the same thing, doubling that up twice. Now the first thing I do is lightly wet the material that's inside the bowl. Once everything is moist, I'm going to turn this towards you so you can see, because right now you're probably wondering what's happening inside the bowl. So let's revolve that around a little bit. So on the low speed, I slide the spatula to the bottom 3 times. 1, 2, and 3. Whatever wasn't mixed on the spatula, I'm going to pick up with the tip and drop it to the bottom, and do the same thing again now on the high speed. So just lightly slide it to the bottom 3 times. 1, 2, and 3. When everything's mixed, I'm going to pull out the material by sliding the spatula up the side of the bowl. And that's a simple way of how to use the material. At this point, I'm now going to unload the material. Again, taking a small amount of that material on the back of the patient's hand. And at this point then I can actually ask the patient to say, watch whilst this turns white. I'm then going to go into the mouth to take our impression. Again, another 20 seconds inside the mouth, nice and rapid. Now, this does have a choice of mint, cherry, or bubblegum flavoring. We can choose. I prefer personally the cherry, but in the case of working with a material that has a flavoring, when this goes into the mouth, the flavor disappears and it's just leaving a scent. The idea with that is it actually makes the patient still think there's flavor, but it cuts down on the salivation so they don't produce saliva with a mouthful of impression tray and material and then saliva when they end up gagging. So this now becomes a little bit more gag resistant, which of course is much kinder to the patient. So after our 20 seconds, we're then going to obviously open up, and then we'll talk about how to pour the perfect model. I've just changed over my bowl from I'm going to be using the alginator to mix up my stone. So again, I've just changed over from the alginate bowl that I was using previously to the stone bowl. Again, I can obviously do the same thing as if I wish to by mixing by hand, but again, let's just give you an idea of how to mix up the stone and how to get the best possible mix. Now, most of you probably out there eyeball it, so rather than guessing this, we're going to measure our water. So for every full impression that we're pouring, we're going to use the same amount of water that we would normally use for our alginates, in this case, the second level. So instead of using the water measure, which again might interfere with the temperature, I'm going to use room temperature water that's kept inside the H2O dispenser. Again, to accelerate stone set, rather than using just hot water, a quarter teaspoonful of table salt. We would then add that into our water and then make sure it's fully dissolved. And then when we go to use it, it's going to accelerate the set. So normally quarter teaspoonful inside, pour the water in, dissolve it, and then add your stone, and that's going to accelerate it. Alternatively, there's something else which is called using slurry water, and that's where we would, if we have a model trimmer in the office, we grind against the surface of the model trimmer and collect the grindings, which come in like a slurry, a sort of a milky colored water. Collect that, and instead of using our regular water, use the slurry water to mix. It accelerates the stone. The only problem with that is there's a little more contraction, expansion, so it's changing the dimensional stability of the stone, whereas the table salt doesn't change that at all. So let's go ahead and do the mix of stone. So Second level of water for our regular impressions. Again, if we've got a large impression, we want to change it to 3 scoops, or a single scoop if we've got a half impression. So I'm just now measuring my water. Once it's up to the white cap, again, just release, let go. And now put our water into the bowl. Now at this point I'm going to use our stone. In this case I'm using a green stone. This has quite a long setting time, but again it's got a nice working ability. What I'm going to do at this point is slowly sift the stone onto the surface. The stone will absorb into the water, and I'll turn this towards you in just a moment so you can see what's going to happen. It's going to reach a point where it saturates. That means to say that the water will absorb that powder that I'm pouring in. And the way that we know how we've got the best working ability is that on the surface of the stone we would have a small dry area and it would look almost like cracking. So let's combine these two together and show you what I'm talking about. Now, it's still absorbing inside, but let's see if I can turn this towards you, you can have a look inside. It almost looks like there's a small amount of cracking on the surface. I don't know if you can pick this up on the camera. Inside there. So there's cracking on the surface. Now when I combine these two together, I'll end up with what we are looking for is the best ultimate mix, as if it was done measured by weight and by volume. So I'm just combining these two together, and this is the type of mix that we should be getting. It looks somewhat dry, but we do want to have a dry mix. Now after we've combined these two together, I'm going to put this back onto the alginator, and then I'll turn this around towards you. I'll do the same procedure that I did previously. So lightly slide this down 3 times. 1, 2, and 3 times. Just making sure that everything was picked up. Drop to the bottom, and then the same thing on the high speed, the same procedure. And at this point we have all our material mixed. We're now going to be taking out the material and slowly vibrating it into our impression. Now, very important to look at our impression. First off, we want to make sure that the impression had been disinfected. Normally that's done as soon as we've taken the impression. We'll spray it with a disinfecting spray, but making sure that if it's a very fine spray, there's no way that a fine spray will reach the bottom part, especially for lower anterior teeth that are long and narrow. So if it's possible on a sprayer and it has a chance of changing the coarseness of the spray, do so, because we want to have large particles that are entering down inside. The contact time is again according to the manufacturer of our disinfecting solutions. So normally it's anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. Then we rinse it under the tap, shake off the excess, and then we're ready to pour. So what I'm going to do first off is take a small amount of our stone and start using the dental vibrator. The dental vibrator, in this case I'm using the Whip-Mix general purpose vibrator. It's just around $100. It's very well priced. As I turn on the unit, it has a variable speed over here from low to high. I put it on a medium setting, not high. Hold the tray on the surface of the vibrator lightly. Don't hold it down hard, because if you hold it down hard, let's turn this off for a moment so we can hear. If I hold this down hard, what will happen is all the vibrations travel through the tray into my hand, into my arm. It feels really good, but it doesn't do anything for the impression tray. I want to hold it down nice and lightly. So let's turn this back on again. Put a small amount of that stone on the surface and just allow it to seep in. Take a little bit more of that material and do the same thing again. Now at this moment I'm just allowing the stone purely to enter through the teeth only. Notice I do not want the stone to vibrate at all at a period of time too long. That's it. I do not want to vibrate anymore, so let's turn this off. One of the worst things that you can do is taking your bowl with a mix on top of the vibrator, and I see every office doing this. They watch all the little bubbles come from the surface, but what it's going to do is actually take more air from around the surface of the bowl, put it back through the mix, and so you're actually aerating the mix, which is really what we don't want to do. We want to try and squeeze all the air out. The vibrator that we're using is just a method of transferring the stone into the impression as quickly as possible. So the longer we spend vibrating the stone in, plaster in, we're going to produce more bubbles. So again, eliminate that time. Try to cut it down. So let's come back. I'm going to put this back onto the alginator. Once it's secure on the alginator, I'm going to take off a small amount of the stone and place that into my mold. So at this point I'm just building up the amount, and this is going to be my base. So I've now taken out all the stone from the bowl. Let's give you an idea what's happened. That's how much stone is left behind, nice and clean. At this point I want to ensure that my stone that I've mixed, there's still a shiny surface. That's where the material is still starting now, obviously, to go through its initial set. Once it's reached the initial set stage, that shiny surface disappears, and the material, of course, becomes a lot thicker. And that's the point where I want to shape the top of the model that I'm forming. So I'll let that set a little bit longer, and we'll come back as soon as that's happened. Our bowls, we want to just make sure there's no residue left inside. So what I'm going to do is use a material that's called the Mizzy PIP spray that's available from your dental supplier. By spraying this inside, wiping with a Kleenex 2x2, gauze, whatever, or in this case, Kleenex, and just lightly wiping through, just removes any residue that was inside the surface. It imparts a non-stick, almost like a silicone solution, and also disinfects the bowl. So now I know I'm safe, ready to go. So our bowls are nice and clean. We can put our alginator aside, but come back to our model. So again, we've waited for that surface shine to dissipate, and then we can actually smooth now our surface and begin to shape our stone. And this is going to save us a lot more time than later on, when the stone will be hard. So I'm just lightly going to flatten out the surface. I'm still going to have enough base, which of course is very important. We need to have a good base on our model. But I'm just flattening the surface over here, and I don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Trimming off a little bit of excess where necessary. As I say again, this just literally will save us time later on when we are on a model trimmer. So it just reduces that period of time that we would normally spend on the model trimmer. So we'll come back to this after the stone itself has set, and carve a little bit more off over there. Just making sure the surface is nice and flat so that once it rests on a surface later on, it doesn't fall around. And I will leave this then to set, and then finally trim once the stone has been separated from the impression. Now the nice thing about this material, remember I said it has 4 days stability, but it also, I can re-pour this twice. That means I can actually get 2 models, a working model, study model from the same impression. There are a variety of different ways of keeping our trays nice and clean. Now of course that's more important when we're talking about our metal trays. Remember, our disposable trays are a one-time use. But we need to clean the alginate as well as the stone and plaster. Of course, it's much more difficult with a perforated tray where the alginate's seeping through the perforations. So what we should normally be doing once we've removed our models, separated them, and ready to clean out the impression tray, break off all the material from the external portion of the tray. That means literally with a finger or a knife, but usually a finger's better, just literally pull off all the little nodules of the alginate away from the tray, and then it's much easier to pull out the impression tray. the impression material that's caught inside here. Then they go into a soak solution that's going to remove any residue that's left inside. The general tray cleaner from Bosworth is probably one of the best effects. I've tried pretty much all the systems out there, and this produces a nice, shiny, clean surface of the impression tray. One capful, these crystals dissolve very quickly, so just a matter of dissolving them through. In your regular bath of water that you're going to be putting this into, it dissolves fast, and then they're left to soak. Anywhere from 10 minutes through to, you can leave it in overnight, but most times within a couple of hours. It just will remove any residue of stone, plaster, as well as alginate. To conclude this portion of our impression taking, we have covered the types of impression trays, how to care for them, what the differences are between the trays, how to handle an alginate, how to mix an alginate, and then also stone and plaster handling as well.